Hello friend, I'm Sean, and you're watching Vanished Files. 2 centuries ago, the Chinese held a profound belief. China was the universal state, the Middle Kingdom or Zhonghua. They envisioned a world with the Han nation at its center, surrounded by barbarian or uncivilized peoples. This worldview meant that the Chinese imperial court had no need for a foreign affairs department, after all. No other nation was considered its equal. This pride wasn't unfounded. In its time, China truly had no match, whether in Asia, Africa, or the Far East. When Europe was fractured and struggling after the fall of the Roman Empire, China was a flourishing, progressive, and grand civilization. For 600 years, from the 8th to the 14th centuries, Chinese naval vessels embarked on journeys to ports across the globe, engaging in trade and diplomatic missions. What's remarkable is that they never sought to conquer or occupy any regions under the guise of trade. Their sole reason: they simply didn't view anyone as worthy of joining their Middle Kingdom. They believed Zhonghua was supreme, so they neither took land nor allowed others to take theirs. The zenith of this golden age of Chinese maritime exploration came in its final phase. At the dawn of the 15th century, a Muslim admiral named Zheng He led an immense naval fleet out into the world. Born Mahi into a Hui Muslim family in Henan province, Ma was a substitute for Muhammad. As a child, Mahi was brought to the Ming court, where he was castrated, a common practice to prevent reproduction and ensure loyalty. His intelligence and prowess in seafaring missions eventually earned him a new name from the emperor, Zheng He. For 2 decades, from 1404 to 1424, Zheng He undertook 6 monumental sea voyages, traversing vast distances for trade and diplomacy. His fleet was staggering: 200 ships, 28,000 crewmen, and a substantial escort navy. The Yongle Emperor of the Chinese Ming Dynasty was the grand patron of these expeditions. Zheng He's journeys took him to Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Sri Lanka, Iran, and even across the Red Sea to East Africa. On each journey, he exchanged gifts and presented detailed reports to the emperor's court. He brought back an array of exotic animals from Africa and India, including elephants, giraffes, zebras, tigers, and ostriches. As a testament to China's diplomatic reach, hundreds of representatives from 30 global states returned with him, many settling permanently in China's coastal areas. He also meticulously worked to preserve vital sea routes. Thus, until the 15th century, China remained a prosperous, thriving state, deeply connected to the outside world. A significant shift occurred with the death of the Yongle Emperor in 1424 CE. His successor held no favor for these naval missions, deeming them a wasteful expenditure of time and resources. Courtiers, eager to see state funds utilized domestically, further swayed the new emperor. Their primary concern was allocating money to defend northern China from incessant Mongol invasions. In a drastic move, the new emperor ordered the burning of Zheng He's maritime maps, ship blueprints, and other crucial materials. Construction on naval vessels ground to a halt, and existing ships were left to rust in the sea. Zheng He, once an iconic figure, became disheartened and marginalized. A decade later, on a voyage to India, he passed away at sea. Admiral Zheng He, a titan of Chinese seamanship, spent his life on the ocean, and his body was returned to it, perhaps, as some say, to feed the fish. With his death, China's grand maritime expeditions were effectively buried. Today, a replica of one of his ships is displayed in an artificial lake near the Yangtze River in Nanjing. A park and museum in China bear his name, and in Indonesia, a mosque honors him, recognizing his role as a protector and diplomat in the Far East. Zheng He also has a symbolic grave in China, though it holds no physical remains. Following Zheng He's demise, the Chinese court deliberately isolated itself from the outside world for the next 4 centuries. Sea routes were closed, and even land routes were restricted. China turned inward, focusing on fortifying the Great Wall against Mongol incursions and managing its rapidly expanding population, while some trade in tea and silk continued. Maintaining a tenuous connection with the world, the emperor's court severed all literary and diplomatic ties with Asia, the Far East, Africa, and Europe. The Grand Zhonghua, the Middle Kingdom, chose isolation, a decision that would lead to equally grand losses in the future. While Europe underwent the Industrial Revolution, progressing at an astonishing pace, China remained utterly unaware and untouched by these developments. This was particularly detrimental as China desperately needed new ideas to cope with its burgeoning population, which had exploded from 60 to 70 million for centuries to 2 or 3 times that number between the 14th and 18th centuries. The West, also experiencing rapid population growth fueled by the Industrial Revolution and its newfound wealth, simultaneously developed a voracious appetite for Chinese goods. Rich Europeans particularly coveted Chinese silk, tea, and exquisite porcelain. This demand skyrocketed. To capitalize on this insatiable demand, China, despite its isolationist policies, maintained a single narrow window for international trade. The port of Guangzhou, also known as Canton. No other route in China permitted the export or import of goods, save for certain specific ports used for trade with nearby islands like Korea. Beyond this exclusivity, China imposed another significant condition. It refused to accept foreign currency for its goods, primarily from the British and Dutch. Instead, China demanded silver coins. This policy led to a massive accumulation of European wealth, specifically silver dubbed white gold, within China, significantly boosting its economy. However, it created a colossal problem for the Europeans, as China bought virtually nothing from them in return, leading to a massive trade imbalance entirely in China's favor. This widening trade imbalance deeply frustrated the British Crown, leading them to devise a horrifying solution to reclaim their silver wealth: the illegal smuggling of a dark paste-like substance that induced a peaceful, often deadly, sleep. This substance was opium. Bengali military officers under British command forced Indian farmers to cultivate it, amassing huge stockpiles. This opium was then packed into chests and illegally smuggled into China. Each chest contained 60 to 65 kilograms of the drug. The British Royal Court and the East India Company made a calculated decision to sell this opium to China for silver coins, effectively reversing the trade imbalance, albeit through illegal and profoundly immoral means. It was illegal because, like China, opium was banned in Britain itself, with violations punishable by death. Yet, King George III sanctioned this illicit trade in collusion with the East India Company. Opium smuggling proved incredibly lucrative, attracting a network of Chinese youth who willingly participated. A supply chain was established, ensuring a continuous flow of opium to Chinese youth, who, in turn, became a burden on their already overpopulated nation and a source of income for their enemies. These young addicts would spend their days idly, in tea houses and street corners, puffing and sniffing opium, lost in a drug-induced stupor. Britain engaged in opium smuggling on an industrial scale, devastating both the Chinese economy and its youth. By the mid-18th century, 15 tons of opium were being smuggled into China annually, a figure that doubled or tripled by the turn of the century. By 1840 CE, Britain was smuggling a staggering 3,000 tons of opium into China, earning approximately £6 million from this illegal trade. China was, in essence, paying to destroy its own people. Compounding this tragedy, China's silver coin reserves rapidly depleted as the opium trade was conducted primarily in silver. This, in turn, caused a swift devaluation of the Chinese copper currency. The value of silver coins skyrocketed. Farmers who earned in copper currency but were required to pay taxes in silver found themselves in an impossible situation. An ounce of silver, which once fetched 700 to 800 copper coins, surged to 2,500 copper coins within a few years of the opium smuggling. Farmers became unable to pay their taxes. This ripple effect of the opium trade engulfed China, leading to widespread unrest. In 1794 CE, farmers in the central Chinese regions of Sichuan, Hubei, and Shenzhen revolted. They received immense support from the Buddhist monks of the White Lotus Society, giving rise to the White Lotus Rebellion. The White Lotus Buddhists propagated the belief that the return of Maitreya Buddha was imminent. They convinced the populace that Buddha would alleviate their suffering, free them from royal oppression, and significantly improve their economic conditions. Therefore, to welcome Maitreya, they argued, it was imperative to overthrow the monarchy through a farmers' rebellion. The White Lotus Rebellion was so formidable that it took the Qing Imperial Army 8 years, from 1794 to 1804, to crush it completely. Conservative estimates suggest that between 100,000 and 200,000 Chinese were directly killed in the fighting. However, the indirect toll was far more devastating. Approximately 2 million people perished due to the war's effects. Crops were destroyed, cultivation ceased, drought brought famine, and widespread disease claimed the lives of another 1 to 2 million. It was a horrific tragedy, but tragically, only the beginning. In the early days of this rebellion, another ill omen arrived on the Chinese coasts from London, dispatched by King George III. In 1793 CE, King George III sent a high-level delegation to China. Ostensibly, this delegation brought gifts for the 83rd birthday of the Chinese Qianlong Emperor, but this was merely a facade. In reality, the delegation's true purpose was to secure a permanent head office in Peking, modern-day Beijing, with full royal rights. This office would serve as a central hub for managing opium smuggling throughout China, much like the British had established Fort William in Calcutta, India, complete with an army for security. Before ultimately seizing control of the entire country, they arrived in China with the exact same blueprint. Leading this delegation was Lord George Macartney, Among the gifts were a modern cannon, a mechanical clock, a telescope, and other marvels of Britain's thriving industrial sector. However, the emperor paid little attention to this delegation, failing to grasp the scientific advancements these gifts represented or what China could learn from them. Crucially, the emperor was wary of granting the British permission for a head office with such extensive business rights. The emperor treated the British delegation with the same condescension. A son of heaven from the Middle Kingdom would show 2 representatives from surrounding minor states. According to court tradition, Lord Macartney was required to perform the kowtow, bowing thrice and prostrating his head to the ground 9 times. This was the traditional Chinese gesture of loyalty and submission to the emperor. Lord Macartney flatly refused, asserting that the Chinese emperor could not treat a British representative like a commoner. The emperor, in turn, dismissed the British delegation's conditions and sent them back empty-handed. The English delegation's return to King George III in London marked a second major insult for the king in a short period. Just a decade earlier, in 1783, the British Army had suffered a humiliating defeat, losing its 13 American colonies. The English commander, Lord Cornwallis, had surrendered to American commander George Washington, and the subsequent Treaty of Paris saw the United States renounce allegiance to the British king. After this profound humiliation in the West, Britain faced another severe insult in the East. King George III, enraged by this double affront, retaliated by escalating opium smuggling into China. The Chinese emperor, in response, intensified policing efforts. British traders would dock at the designated foreign trade port of Canton and smuggle opium from its adjacent areas. In the 1830s, the emperor appointed Lin Zexu as a special commissioner, tasked with curbing illegal opium smuggling by all means necessary. Commissioner Lin Zexu established his office in Canton and declared death for both opium users and peddlers. Initially, he held a peculiar view, believing the fault lay with the Chinese consumers and importers. He senselessly reasoned that if the Chinese simply stopped buying opium, imports would automatically cease. This was absolute nonsense, as he failed to grasp the complexities of the supply chain, human addiction, and greed. Consequently, his early ideas yielded no results. Although he initially mandated the confiscation of opium pipes and seized around 100,000, scores of Chinese were arrested and some even executed. It was to no avail. However, with time, Lin Zexu learned that unless the opium supply line was completely dismantled, the Chinese could never break free from their addiction. This meant a confrontation with the British was inevitable. But by this time, Britain had become a formidable power. The shock of losing the American colonies and the defeat there had been washed away by their victory over Napoleon Bonaparte at Waterloo. British imperial morale was soaring. They once again saw themselves, and projected themselves, as the global superpower. In the 1830s, the volume of opium they sold in China had surpassed even official trade. In just 2 years, from 1831 to 1833, Britain sold opium worth $14 million to Chinese youth. 10 million Chinese had become addicted to opium, and a quarter of them were public servants. Beyond smugglers and traders, Christian priests also played a role. These priests would offer a free packet of opium to any Chinese youth who would recite a chapter from the Bible. The church doors even provided a sanctuary for these young men to smoke opium. Priests from Britain, Ireland, and Scotland also collected charity in the name of Jesus. Eventually, British traders began accepting Chinese products, silk, utensils in exchange for opium, further eroding China's control over its economy. The emperor and his court received neither taxes nor accurate records of imports and exports. The special commissioner and the Chinese emperor endured sleepless nights. However, China still wished to avoid a direct confrontation with the British traders. So, Lin Zexu penned a letter to the 20-year-old Queen Victoria of Britain. The original copy of this letter still exists, and an English translation is available in Howard University's online library. Lin wrote to the Queen, "Majesty Queen, I have learned that opium smoke is strictly forbidden in your religion, and harsh death penalties are given to those convicted of this crime in your own country. How is it possible that something banned in your country by law and religiously is being exported to others? How would you feel if a country endeavored to make your people addicted to smoke and opium?" The commissioner, in essence, implored the Queen to halt opium smuggling into China. But the British did not even bother to reply, much less curtail the opium trade. In fact, the $14 million earned by British traders from opium in 2 years during the early period of Queen Victoria's reign soared to $18 million annually. It was time for China to act. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu issued a stark warning to all foreign traders: surrender all opium chests to the government within 3 days, or face death. He even offered incentives, rewarding foreigners based on the number of chests they deposited. British traders, however, scoffed at this order. Lin Zexu then demonstrated his resolve, arresting 2 opium smugglers and publicly executing them. Alarmed, some British traders surrendered a small portion of their opium, a mere 2%, the commissioner noted. Infuriated, Lin Zexu used his full imperial authority to surround the famous British 13 factories, where some 3,000 British and other employees were located. Their supplies were cut off. They were, in effect, taken prisoner by the Chinese. The siege lasted 6 weeks until the British handed over approximately 20,000 chests filled with opium to the Chinese authorities. Commissioner Lin Zexu hired 500 workers to destroy this vast quantity of opium. 3 deep pits were dug near a waterway. The opium was dumped into them, layered with salt and chemicals to dissolve it and neutralize its chemical properties. Water was kept in these pits for 2 feet until the opium was completely dissolved and its chemistry destroyed, after which it was drained into the waterway leading to the sea. This painstaking process continued for 22 days until all 20,000 chests of opium were destroyed. The opium confiscated by the commissioner was valued at £2.5 million. Since the British Queen also earned substantially from opium smuggling through direct benefits to the crown. She and the British were furious, viewing this as an extreme insult. In humiliation, they raged that addicts and opium eaters had dared to challenge those who defeated Emperor Napoleon at Waterloo, inflicting millions of pounds in losses. Even though opium trade and consumption were serious crimes in Britain itself, gentlemen in London and Manchester demanded punishment for the Chinese. Queen Victoria decided to declare war on China. In 1839, Queen Victoria dispatched George Eliot to teach the Chinese a lesson. He sailed with 16 steel-hulled naval ships and 4,000 soldiers. The Queen's written orders instructed him to blockade Chinese ports, halting all trade until China accepted 6 conditions. The first demand was the return of the entire amount of opium the Chinese destroyed, or its market value in payment. Second, compensation for damages incurred at the British factories that had been surrounded for 6 weeks. Third, the emperor had to guarantee no British citizen would face such trouble in the future. The fourth, and perhaps most insulting condition, was the permanent cession of a Chinese island, along with its populace, to the British. Fifth, an end to China's monopoly on Canton. And sixth, reparations for losses suffered by British traders. Due to Commissioner Lin Zexu's actions, with these disgraceful conditions, the British arrived to surround Canton in the summer. Commodore James Bremer led this naval force. It was then that the Chinese were utterly confounded by the British Navy's preparations. They discovered that the cannons deployed for port defense had been unchecked for 200 years and were now rusty. The Chinese Navy comprised worn-out wooden ships, no match for the advanced, steel-hulled British vessels whose cannons effortlessly bisected Chinese ships. The British ships were also far faster. The Chinese shore guns were obsolete, and their operators were untrained soldiers. The British naval fleet maintained a blockade of the Chinese coasts for 3 years, during which numerous coastal cities, settlements, and forts were decimated. The Chinese emperor repeatedly sent officials to deal with or fight the British. Still referring to these officials as managers of the barbarians, the Chinese emperor, the son of heaven and ruler of the Middle Kingdom, continued to believe he presided over a universal, civilized state surrounded by a disorderly world of barbarians. His perception was far from reality. Consequently, the emperor repeatedly replaced these managers of barbarians due to their failures. The disgraced managers faced severe consequences. Some were banished, others executed, while some were even captured by the British and imprisoned in India. It was a bizarre era of Chinese helplessness. Over 3 years, the British Navy launched so many attacks on Chinese coastal areas that the Chinese were left with nothing but repeated defeats. British ships sailed beyond Canton, past Taiwan, and even reached the origin of the Yangtze River. Chinese forces failed to offer effective resistance anywhere, proving to be as fragile as a wall of sand. In June 1842, Shanghai fell to the British. Another historically significant city, Nanjing, also slipped from Chinese control. China's entire maritime trade was besieged and at the mercy of the British. The Qing court finally understood that its policy of isolation had left them woefully unprepared for modern warfare. In August 1842, the Chinese surrendered, agreeing to negotiate on British terms. British General Hugh Gough summoned Chinese officials to HMS Cornwallis and compelled them to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanjing. The victorious British forced the Chinese to accept even more shameful conditions than the initial 6 laid down by Queen Victoria. As a result, China ceded the small island of Hong Kong, near Canton, to the British. Instead of one exclusive port, 5 major Chinese ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were open to British trade. To compensate British traders for their losses, China was forced to pay 21 million silvertaels, valued at $21 million at the time. A royal guarantee was also given to prevent any future forcible actions against the British. Good behavior towards the British in the Chinese court was also mandated. The following year, a condition was added exempting British residents in China from Chinese law Any complaint against a British citizen would be handled by a British representative according to their own laws. China was also compelled to grant Britain most favored nation status, ensuring all present and future facilities would be extended to British traders. The Chinese emperor, the mighty son of heaven, ruler of the Middle Kingdom, tasted the bitter fruit of centuries of Chinese isolation. The Chinese Middle Kingdom syndrome, the grandeur of the past, was utterly shattered on the deck of a ship ironically named after the commander defeated by America, HMS Cornwallis. The Chinese century of humiliation had begun, but external attacks weren't the only catastrophe. China also faced devastating internal conflicts. A Chinese man, who had failed the civil service examination 3 times, dreamt that a woman told him he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. He awoke and declared his holy kingship in China. As many as 70 million Chinese rallied under his banner. He became their savior and mentor. Due to his affiliation with Christian faith, American, British, German, and Dutch forces began to secretly support him. The Chinese century of humiliation was about to descend into even deeper darkness. A story we'll explore in the next vlog. Don't miss it.